Welcome back, everybody. As you may remember, last video that I showed that I made for you was on the Civil War. I did tell you it was the last of the Civil War. And it's true. There is one more story to tell before we close the chapter. A bit of a tragedy, a bit of an infamous story, which I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with. The story needs to be told nonetheless, because it is a pivotal moment in the history of this country. It's a Friday, so that moment that we're going to talk about, that day, it's 5 days after Lee surrenders, and the Confederacy is no more, and the Civil War is over, and the mood in the capital is quite jubilant, quite euphoric, actually. Finally, this long war is over, and maybe they get back to something closer to normal. It's Friday, April 14th, 1865, and the picture that you're looking at there, as you can see in the caption, this is Ford's Theater. And it's still around today. Roads have been paved. It's a modern place now, but it's actually still in operation. A theater. It's still in operation. I believe it's the oldest theater in the United States. It's still a functioning theater, and it's been functioning ever since then. Probably a lot of it has to do with this particular link to history. And this is where our story today is going to begin and it's going to end, actually. So, once again, it's Friday. The day actually starts, the events of the day actually start pretty early, actually, on breakfast. President Lincoln's having breakfast with Mary Todd at around 8 in the morning. She mentioned something to the effect that she would like to go to Ford's Theater that night. She's heard there's a production called My American Cousin. It's supposed to be very funny. It's a comedy. She'd like to go with Lincoln. Lincoln was known to be a frequent visitor to the theaters around town. That's not something odd. Lincoln did used to go a lot with his Secretary of State, and pretty close confidant William Seward. But for reasons I won't explain later, Seward couldn't attend. And yes, Mary Todd and Lincoln did have a strained marriage, but this was one of those days that things were okay, and he had promised his wife that he would take her. Mary Todd actually made the request that she wanted to go ask if Lincoln could invite the Grants over, which is odd because the two women were not known to get along. I think it might have been an issue of Grant's wife not particularly being too keen about Mary Todd. But nonetheless, Lincoln tells her, yeah, sure, I'll send word. About 2 hours later, he sends a note to Ford's Theater asking them to reserve the state box, which is, I guess, the box where the president and VIPs sit, and word to the War Department that he would like to invite General Grant and his wife to the theater tonight. Here's some images here. Of course, flesh out more setting. Here's a playbill advertising the play that night at Ford's Theater. Already, once the president gave his sent the request that he wanted to attend, I'm sure they sent these to print. It's not something they would do today, actually announcing that the performance would be honored by the presence of President Lincoln. It was supposed to be the last night that main actress Laura Keene was going to perform, and that was going to be a big deal. What we're looking at there is an image of the set design of Ford's Theater, how it probably looked at the night of that performance. And up there we have, I believe that's Mary Todd's case for carrying her binoculars. I believe those were President Lincoln's gloves. Tickets, they didn't sit in the orchestral section, of course, they sat up there in the state box. And then here's an image that I took a couple of years ago, the theater as it looks like today. Now we know of the way the morning worked out. Now that morning also, um, an actor, we'll talk more about him, one of the many actors in DC and working the theater district, if you will, and he had worked in this theater as well. The name of John Wilkes Booth. He actually, by chance, and there's a deeper story here of why he's in DC. But by chance, he stops by Ford's Theater to pick up his mail in the morning, and he hears word from some of the actors that work there that, oh, did you know that President Lincoln's coming tonight? You know, pretty important visit. He's, oh, you don't say. And once he picks up his mail, he heads back to where he was staying in the DC area, a house not too far away, owned, it was actually a boarding house owned by Mary Surratt. He was from Maryland, like John Wilkes Booth was, very much a Confederate sympathizer. And things start falling into place because there's a couple of men that live in that boarding house that are Confederate sympathizers that have struck an acquaintance with John Wilkes Booth. Um, they've been in the DC area for a while, um, and have had their eye on Lincoln for a while. They have been playing around with the idea that if something were to happen to Lincoln, and this is before the war ended, could that possibly end the war favorably? Last ditch effort for the Confederacy. So you can imagine when he hears news that Lincoln's attending the performance tonight, he runs back and he tells his fellow conspirators. Okay, we'll get back to they put together a plan on the spot, really. So a lot of this is like, wow, he just found out in the morning. He runs back, he gets his buddies together, they put a plan together. He was very, very bossy. He was the leader, if you will, of this group. And they're going to pull this plan together at 10 o'clock tonight. John Wilkes Booth knows the play, he knows the script, he knows it word by word. He knows the exact time that he wants to carry out his part of the plan. And there's other synchronized parts to this. And at 10 o'clock, everything is supposed to go down. And of course, President Lincoln is not aware of this. You know, he has his work day. It's Friday around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He receives notice that President Grant, unfortunately, needs to decline that invitation. He's actually on his way to the train station. He's going out of town. Lincoln decides to go ahead and invite Edwin Stanton, since, you know, it's a Secretary of War. The Stantons also declined the invitation. So, after him and Mary going about, you know, well, who should we invite? You know, we do have 2 extra seats in that box. We'd like to invite somebody. President Lincoln actually decides to invite a young couple that are actually friends of the president, a Major Rathbone, who's 28 years old, and his young fiancée, Clara Harris. And of course, they accepted, and that's going to be the president's guest for that night. A note was sent that he'll be picking up at 8 o'clock, which is crazy enough. That's the time that the production is supposed to start. So I guess Lincoln made plans to show up late, which he does show up late. Lincoln arrives about 30 minutes into the production, and which, of course, everything stops. An announcement is made, you know, ladies and gentlemen, you know, we have a special guest, the President of the United States. They played Hail to the Chief as the ushers escorted him to the presidential box. And then they recommenced with their performance. And here's an image that box looks like today. So I'm going to show you in a later image exactly where they were sitting. That door that you're looking at there, that's the door to get into the state box. That's the only door to get into. Now, what I didn't tell you, one of the things that John Wilkes Booth did when he was earlier in the day, he found a piece of wood, kind of like a plank or a 2x4, and he placed it in that room. He already had an idea of what he was going to do, and that plank's going to play a role. So he went back to the Surratt boarding house, he said. So Lincoln's arrived late. Lincoln's bodyguard, John Parker. John Parker was kind of late for his shift. John Parker escorts the president to a state box. The idea that John Parker was supposed to stay outside that door during the performance, as the president and his guests were inside. About half an hour into the play, well, into Lincoln's arrival, so it's about 9 p.m., Parker decides on his own, nothing's going to go on, everything seems to be okay. He decides to leave his post and go next door to a saloon to have a drink. Now, would this have avoided what happened? Maybe, maybe not. See, you have to understand, John Wilkes Booth had every intention of walking into that presidential box. And John Wilkes Booth had an advantage that a stranger off the street wouldn't have. And we're going to talk more about this later on. But John Wilkes Booth was one of the most famous actors in the country. The entire staff, as well as the troupe of thespians, the actors working at the theater, they knew John Wilkes Booth. And it wasn't that he was, an actor. He was a very, very well-known actor from a very, very well-known acting family. So would it have been impossible for Lincoln to approach Parker and request if he could say hi to the president? The president already knew his brother. The president had met with his brother, Edwin Booth, several times already. So I don't think that would have been out of the question that Parker would have opened the door and just allowed Booth to come in. But Parker wasn't there, nonetheless. And so Booth is timing this to a T. During the third act, there's a line that's delivered by one of the characters that's supposed to be funny. It's supposed to elicit laughter. And John Booth was the idea to carry out his act, having it masked by the laughter, and no one would notice. And so it happens. That line is delivered. There is laughter, and at that moment, just before he knows by the script where he needs to be when. He starts heading for the door. Nobody's there. So he opens the door and he enters the presidential box through that door. Now let's talk about who's there. Okay? So that's where in this image where you see them, President Lincoln is sitting there in a rocking chair. It was a bit cold, so yeah, he put on a coat. That's relevant. Sitting next to Mary Todd. And to the right of them, I guess, would be Major Rathbone and Clara Harris. If I remember before this video is over, there's kind of a dark story there as well. Very, very tragic, very dark story, that couple. Booth has two things in his hand. He has a small handgun and he has a knife. He enters the room and it seems like he's unnoticed, and he places the plank of wood that I think was next to the door, and he jams it between the doorknob and the floor. And this is done very quick, of course. And it's at that moment, at around 10:25, that John Wilkes Booth fires that pistol, and it's the back of President Lincoln's head, actually behind his left ear, and the bullet goes into his skull and lodges itself about 7 inches deep. And of course, there's a great deal of yelling and screaming and commotion because a loud, well, actually, a lot of people thought it was part of the play. So at the very people thought it was, they didn't think of it until Mary Todd starts to scream about what happened. Uh, the major stands up to confront John Wilkes Booth, and John Wilkes Booth takes a knife and stabs this guy in the arm. Meanwhile, there's people trying to get to the door to get in, but they can't because the door is jammed. I'm going to stop right there because I want to talk to you about what's going on um, in that same city, not far from there. And we're going to come back to what happened after Booth pulled that trigger. You see, this is part of a larger conspiracy. Booth, of course, is the ringleader. Booth was going to go and kill President Lincoln. But this was a plan that was intended to send the entire Union government into disarray. Lewis Powell was not very familiar with Washington, D.C., but has as much hatred for Lincoln and the Union and all that as everybody else in this group. His target is Secretary of State William Seward, simply because Seward is third in line of succession, being the Secretary of State. And how does that play out? Now, because Powell wasn't from there, one of the other conspirators, David Harrod, his job is to escort Lewis Powell to where Seward lives, wait outside until Seward does what he does, and then meet up with Booth. They had a rendezvous point, meet up with Booth, and then take off out of there. And so at around 10 o'clock, Powell goes and knocks on the door of the Seward house. And they answer, and he claims that he's coming from a nearby pharmacy with medicine for Mrs. Seward. Now, why did Seward not attend uh, this theater production with Lincoln? Seward used to go with Lincoln a lot as a guest. Well, for the simple reason that a couple of days earlier, Seward was involved in a carriage accident. Like a car accident, but yes, there was a carriage accident. It was horrific, and I think it broke several bones and his jawbone. He ended up underneath the carriage and a million things. Well, nonetheless, he is at home healing. He is in bed. He is tied to several contraptions meant to set his bones in place. He actually, you don't see it in that illustration. He has a metal brace um, that's supposed to set his jawbone. Well, so this guy comes in and he knocks on the door. I want to come in, and they already have like doubts. It's weird. He says, "Let me go inside and ask Seward's son." And then this Powell guy helps himself in and toward the stairs. And they're like, well, we weren't expecting anybody from the pharmacy, and then things get violent. Okay. And there's a bit of violence between Powell and Seward's son. He stabs Seward's son, I believe, I think also in the arm or the collarbone or something like that. And he makes his way inside Seward's bedroom. And he stabs the guy repeatedly. Many of these stab wounds are in his face. So here you are, healing from a pretty horrific accident, and this crazy guy comes into your room and begins to puncture your body and slash at your body numerous times with a knife he had on. Actually, what saved Seward's life was the fact that the brace around his jaw actually deflected the blade that would have otherwise punctured his jugular and he would have bled to death. After he feels that he's delivered several mortal blows, he runs out of the house, out into the street. Well, the commotion scares the guy that's supposed to be waiting for him, and that guy takes off. So when Powell runs out to the street claiming that I'm mad, I'm mad, I'm mad, um, Harry's not there to help him. So he's going to be lost and try to figure out his way back to the Surratt house and out of DC. So that was Powell's role. and Harrod's room. One more guy, David Axelrod. I'm sorry, George Axelrod. His job was to go to the hotel where Vice President Andrew Johnson was staying at, the Kirkwood Hotel, and wait for him outside in the lobby. Apparently, they had a bar saloon in the lobby, and it's Friday, 8 o'clock. Probably Johnson was at some point going to go outside for a walk or whatever he was going to do on a Friday night. And he was going to wait for him and kill him there. Well, Axelrod, after a couple of drinks, chickens out. He really didn't want to do this. He was bullied into doing this by Booth. He chickens out and he leaves. And that's what happened with the conspiracy. So Axelrod leaves, doesn't carry out his assassination of Andrew Johnson. Powell tries to assassinate Secretary of State William Seward. Oh, and I didn't tell you, Seward survives until that fails. And then you have the ringleader, John Wilkes Booth, that in a very cowardly fashion, with the president's back towards him, shoots him in the back of the head. So I left you with the commotion. And of course, the theatrics are not over. At that point, John Wilkes Booth has to make his exit. And people are, pounding at the door to open the door. And he decides to jump down. As you can see right there, that's an 11-foot drop. He had spurs onto his boots because there was a horse waiting for him in the back alley behind the theater. And one of the spurs gets caught up in the flag, forcing him to land on one leg and apparently breaking his leg or his ankle. Nobody's quite sure from that 11-foot drop. So you have the viewpoint there. He turns to the crowd that's still screaming. All this takes place within a matter of seconds. And most of the observers claim that he holds, the knife that he still has in his hand, the one that he stabbed the major with. And he says, Sic semper tyrannis, which is the motto of Virginia, thus always to tyrants. And in the chaos, nobody stops him. They're more concerned about the president. He manages to, I think one guy tried to stop him, and I think there was another slash there as well. He decides to, and everybody else, this is John Wilkes Booth. You can't hide from that. Well, who did that? Who killed who was up there? Who jumped from? It was John Wilkes Booth. We know who that guy is. And the horse is waiting in the back, and he gets on his horse and he takes off to the rendezvous point that he agreed with Harry. And so now they're yelling for a doctor. Is there a doctor anywhere? And there are a couple of doctors in attendance. Eventually, the major takes off the plank, and a doctor makes it inside the booth. Another one has to climb up, helped by other people. Some of the doctor that attends to him, he's a battlefield surgeon from the war, so he knows a mortal wound when he sees it. There was a brief discussion about taking him to the White House, but they believed that would actually hurt the president more, the carriage ride. So they decide to take him across the street to the Peterson house. And right there you're looking at Peterson as it looks today. It's actually maintained by the National Park Service. And you can do this today. You go to the Ford's Theater. The National Park Service runs Ford Theater. They have a fantastic presentation. And when they're done with the presentation, they walk everybody across the street to the Peterson house because the other part of that story unfolds there. Peterson was a tailor. He used to rent out some of the rooms in his house because it was a rather big house for one person. And so they basically take President Lincoln across the street to the Peterson house. And towards the back of the first floor, one of the bedrooms. And what you're looking at there is the bedroom that they lay the president to rest. The president was a really tall guy. I believe he was 6'4". And because of the railings of that bed, the president had to be laid down diagonally, as in his feet were hanging over the side because that bed could not accommodate his body. And it's not a very large room, but That's where they laid him down. The doctors that attended to him in the theater are there first, and then, of course, messages sent. His personal physician comes over, and several other um, important surgeons, at least tied to the government. They show up before long. Um, the doctors try to do their best, not just to figure out what actually happened, but if they could alleviate the situation. They discover the bullet that's 7 inches in, but there's no way to take that out. They do take out several bone fragments, and what they ended up doing is they spent all night removing clots that would form because the clots would, would relieve pressure on the president's brain by removing these clots. The president was unconscious; he was in a coma-like state. He was breathing though, and that's pretty much what the doctors were doing all through the night, giving comfort. And in that case, it was alleviating pressure on the brain by removing the clots that would accumulate. And one by one, they started arriving. Robert Lincoln shows up. Tad, who was at the Children's Theater um, with John Hay. John Hay was Lincoln's personal secretary. Watching a production of Aladdin, he was not allowed inside the room, but Robert, who was already in his early 20s, was allowed in. Of course, Mary Todd is there. She's unconsolable. Gideon Wells, the Secretary of the Navy, comes in. Edwin Stanton comes in. Edwin Stanton takes control of the whole situation while he's there. He actually has Mary Todd removed from the room. And for at least the next 12 hours, the entire government is run from that room at the command of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He also, at Lincoln's bedside, puts together the manhunt, the investigation and the manhunt for not just John Wilkes Booth, but anybody that might have been with him and been involved in this assassination. And he does send her away. The actress, Laura Keene, actually was by the president's bedside the whole time holding his hand. In her words, so that the president would be aware that he had a friend. So she just sat there in silence holding the president's hand while all sorts of dignitaries and functionaries with the government and surgeons came in. Um, I mean, they didn't all come in all at once because it's a small room, but throughout the course of the night, several visitors attended Lincoln's bedside. Here's an interesting painting. It's not meant to be realistic because, of course, the room in no way, shape, or form would have accommodated that many people. But there are, several people that you could make out, because they did attend. This is supposed to represent everybody that actually attended. They came to give their last respects to Lincoln as he laid on his deathbed. Andrew Johnson, Gideon Wells, um, standing in the front with a handkerchief in his hand, Robert Lincoln, uh, Edwin Stanton, Mary Todd, Laura Keene, even that young couple that was them, they followed everybody to that room as well. And here's another image I want to show you. And by the way, this is a famous painting. This painting here is the only known eyewitness account painting of Lincoln's final hours outside the Peterson House as news spread throughout the city that the president had been shot. Outside the Peterson House, crowds began to assemble, um, people praying, people in grief, waiting on word of President Lincoln inside and how he was doing, and et cetera, et cetera. And this was actually an impression painted by somebody that was actually there um, that night. And it's going to be all night. President Lincoln shot around 10 p.m. and he's going to linger for many hours, all through the night, until he eventually passes away at 7:22 in the morning the following day, April 15th, 1865. By 10 o'clock in the morning, Andrew Johnson is sworn into office as the next president of the United States by Chief Justice Samuel Chase. A couple of weird facts I want to leave you with. Um, that bed that Lincoln died in, Edwin Booth had actually laid in that bed about a week earlier because Peterson had rented out that room to an actor that was working at the Ford Theater across the street who was a friend of John Wilkes Booth. So, a creepy, weird coincidence. He had actually laid in that same bed. Um, and there's also another story. Robert Lincoln's going to be the only one of Lincoln's surviving sons. And he was actually saved from being hit by a train by John Wilkes' older brother and more famous brother, Edwin Booth. So that's another weird connection. And what was joy and jubilance over the end of the war quickly turns to grief. Expressions of grief and come in from all over the world. Of course, there's a manhunt. We're going to come back to that. And instead of victory celebrations, plans are put together for the president's funeral procession. The president is going to be buried in Illinois. His official funeral, actually takes place April 21st, 1865. And that is several days after the president passes away. It doesn't take long to catch the conspirators. It doesn't take long, to connect the dots. John Wilkes Booth. Anybody knows where he was staying? Yes, he was staying in the Surratt Inn. Let's go to the Surratt Inn. Uh, the first guy they meet there a couple of days later is Lewis Powell. They ask him, where have you been? Blah blah blah. He says that he's just a laborer that was hired by Mary Surratt. She claimed that she never knew him. They take him into custody. They come back a couple of days later with George. And then later they arrest her because they came back to the house several times and they found proof that, yes, that she did know Lewis Powell, so she was lying. So this manhunt was a pretty serious thing. They were offering serious money at the time. $100,000 reward for the murderer, John Wilkes Booth. And these four are not the only ones. They're also looking for other people. And David Herod, but hold on to the 26th because there's a reason why he's erected on the 26th. The first people they bring into custody are Lewis Powell and George Aswad. They left Mary alone. And they came back for Mary later on when they found out that she had lied to them. And before we leave, let's talk a bit about John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was from Maryland. He was from a famous acting family, although his brother Edwin was much more famous than he was. Actually, we're considered one of the greatest actors in the country, personally known by Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth um, had moved into the D.C. area um, some time before the assassination. Actually, on March 18th, John Wilkes Booth actually headlined um, a play um, in the Ford's Theater a week before everything. That's when he was performing at the Ford's Theater on March 18th. So I guess that would be a month earlier, right? That's that day that he by chance lay down in the same bed in the Peterson's house that Lincoln would die in later. He was not staying at the Surratt house. He was staying elsewhere, but he would meet at the Surratt house a lot with Powell and Atzelrod. And oh, there's another guy there, John Surratt. That guy, as soon as everything went down, he took off. He went to Canada, to Quebec. He went to Europe. Eventually, he was caught in Egypt. Okay, but like sometime later. Right there, we see, a very rare occurrence. John and Edwin with their father Junius acting in the production of Julius Caesar. I believe that was in New York, and John Wilkes Booth was actually there for the second inauguration of President Lincoln, in which he comments in his diary that he was so close. He had this absolute hatred for Lincoln, absolute racist, absolute hatred for Lincoln, absolute hatred for the Union, blamed himself that only if he had done more. He didn't fight. He was in a regiment at the beginning of the war, but didn't stay there long. He actually was present at the execution of John Brown. So yes, it's an actor. It's an actor. And he even remarked, "Oh, I could have killed him that day." Actually, the original plan was to kidnap Lincoln. I think I mentioned that earlier, and then it turned into, an assassination, and it was pretty much on the fly, improvised, all on Booth happening to visit the Ford Theater that morning, picking up his mail, and getting news that Lincoln was going to go later on that evening. So what happened to Booth? Booth meets up with Herod the night of the assassination. They meet at this rendezvous point, and they leave. Um, by midnight, they're at the Surratt Tavern, which is not the same as the Surratt Inn. The Surratt Inn was in D.C. The Surratt Tavern, also owned by Mary Surratt, but in Maryland. That's where they had kept a lot of their guns. They go and they pick up a couple of guns. Um, the next day, so it's April 15th already. The next day, they go to the home of a friend and confidant, Dr. Mudd, to set Booth's leg. A day later, they're in South Maryland. They stay at the home of a Samuel Cox. That by letting these people stay in his home, he becomes, part of this conspiracy as well. Um, Around April 23rd, these guys are like wandering. Uh, they camped out in the woods. Um, and then on the 26th, some people, there's a manhunt, told the authorities that they saw these two odd guys wandering around a farm. And before you know it, they're surrounded by Union soldiers in a barn. Uh, Herod gives up and he's taken into custody. That's why you saw his picture. And that was his mugshot, basically. Booth does not want to give up, and the Union soldiers light the barn on fire with the idea that with the fire, the guy will give up and he'll run out and he'll get apprehended. The orders were to take him alive. But one soldier, I guess you see an illustration of him, Boston Corbett, apparently wasn't very good at following directions. And when a hole, because of the fire, opens up on the barn side wall, he takes the opportunity to shoot John Wilkes Booth. And it's an injury. It's a mortal wound. But he's not going to die instantly. They drag him out. And people claim that he asked to look at his hands. And he says, useless, useless. And then he dies. Not that it's relevant to Lincoln's assassination, but I wanted to bring it up. The day after John Wilkes Booth was chased down and killed is the deadliest maritime disaster in U.S. history. A riverboat, the Sultana, ferrying Union soldiers from Louisiana back home to the north. There was an explosion in the boiler room, and 1,800 Union soldiers died in that disaster. I just thought that's something you should know. So what about the rest of them? Where's Jefferson Davis? Jefferson Davis went to Danville when Richmond fell. But from that point forward, um, all the higher ups that traveled with him split up. His plan was to go to England. And so, traveling with his wife, he made his way slowly but surely through the houses of friends and confidants. And he's in Georgia by May 10th. And of course, there's a manhunt. And on May 10th, 1865, in Irwin County, Georgia, Union troops catch up to um, Jefferson Davis. The story goes that his wife tried to dress him up in her clothes to evade capture. And so they tried to make it into like, oh, he tried to dress up as a woman to escape. He was taken into custody and detained at Fort Monroe, Virginia, for 2 years, as was Alexander Stevens. And you know what happened at the end of those 2 years? They let him go. And Jefferson Davis is going to live to be an old man. He goes into the insurance business, no longer into politics, and he never faces any consequence for this this tragedy in American history in which he took a leadership role. And lastly, this is a pretty powerful picture. I'm sorry, but on July 7th, uh, that was the finale of the trial of the conspirators behind Lincoln's assassination. Lewis Powell, for his role in the attempted murder of William Seward, George Axelrod, for being an accessory to this conspiracy, even though he decided not to try to do anything to Johnson. David Herod for being an accessory to the attempted murder of Secretary of State Seward. Even Mary Surratt, it's the only woman there, for giving shelter and aid to these assassins. All four of them were hung. Others received jail sentences. Um, and they were tried by a military court, by the way. Soon after that, Congress is going to pass laws prohibiting that sort of thing, but they were not tried in a civilian court of law, nor were they offered a civilian trial. Uh, Her son, John Surratt, is going to be captured sometime later, and they decide to drop charges on him. Spirit of reconciliation. And that was the last Civil War story I wanted to tell you. The tragedy of the assassination of President Lincoln. And at this very critical juncture in American history, with the war over, the work of rebuilding the country yet to begin, the country finds itself leaderless in the most tragic way possible. Next time we speak about what comes next, the period referred to as Reconstruction.